Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as always, from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA, bringing you on another trek through the world of U.S. history. And I thought that since last week's episode was about songs which people may or may not know are actually covers, I thought that a good topic for this week would be about the instrument on which some of those artists accompanied themselves. And no, I don't mean the piano, the trumpet, the harp, the tuba, the French horn, or any other instruments out there. I am referring, of course, to the guitar, because America has a very storied history with the instrument. The guitar is an instrument that knows no genre. Can be used in jazz, pop, country, bluegrass, or any of the other genres of music out there. So I thought this week's episode should be about the history of the American guitar and the American guitar companies. Believe it or not, a magazine article published in 1819 stated that the guitar, and I quote, is in this country little valued because little known. Now, it may have been little known in 1819, however, history of the guitar on the continental U.S. goes back to about the time Europeans first landed on the continent. Spanish colonists and missionaries brought the aristocratic six-course vihuela de mano, as well as a smaller four-course and five-course guitars to the New World. Also, if you're wondering, course means the strings assigned to a single note, which, in the case of the guitars made prior to the late 18th century, was typically 2 strings per note, similar to the modern 12-string guitar. And the vihuela, whose name I'm pretty sure I'm mispronouncing, had a comparatively large body shaped much like a modern guitar. 6 courses and tied-on gut frets. And also, if you're wondering what the difference is between a vihuela and a regular guitar, well, the vihuela has 5 strings and is tuned similarly to the guitar, but the difference is the G, D, and A strings are tuned an octave higher than a regular guitar. This guitar was widely played until about the mid-16th century when the 5-course instrument came into favor. The smaller instruments were popular with amateur musicians, mostly those who didn't care to put in the study to practice necessary to master the vihuela or the lute. And it should be noted the French were almost as passionate about the guitar as the Spanish were during the 16th and 17th centuries. And guitarists were among the earliest French explorers and settlers in America. And of course, French colonization ranged from Canada and the northern regions of the current United States down the Mississippi Valley to present-day Louisiana and even the Caribbean. And contrary to popular belief, English settlers were highly musical people. In fact, the most popular household instrument was a cittern, which was a plucked string instrument shaped kind of like a lute, but with a flat back like a guitar and strung with 9 or 10 wire strings. Gut strings were a bit rarer, but could still be found. And there are many accounts of American guitar players in the mid-18th century, but these were most likely players of the wire-strung cittern, or English guitar. The gut string guitar fell out of favor for a few decades in the 18th century, but the English guitar continued to be a favorite among the colonists. And professional musicians occasionally played the English guitar in concert, but mostly it was an instrument played at home by both men and women. Benjamin Franklin's family played the instrument, and Thomas Jefferson's family owned many English guitars. And by the 19th century, gut string guitars were almost universally referred to as Spanish guitars in advertisements by American instrument makers and teachers. And in fact, the term Spanish guitar had been used in America to describe gut strings instruments as early as 1764. And that term is still used today alongside classical guitar, as gut strings have fallen out of fashion and been replaced with nylon. However, English guitar versus Spanish guitar was not the only distinction among the instruments called guitars during this period. And an announcement of a recital by Louis Vidal in 1774 stated Mr. Vidal would play a, and I quote, sonata on the guitar Italian. He also advertised himself as a teacher on the English and French guitars. Many other sources also made clear reference to Italian and French guitars. How these instruments differed from Spanish guitars, however, is unclear, and perhaps not very important. An important detail about these early guitars was they had 2 strings attached to a single peg. This can still be found on 12-string guitars. Single-string guitars, first with 5 strings and then 6, probably first appeared in Italy during the 1770s. However, they soon spread to France, and members of Thomas Jefferson's family probably or may have become acquainted with the instrument in Paris, where they lived for several years during the 1780s when Thomas Jefferson was the United States ambassador to France. And Jefferson bought a guitar while in Paris for his daughter Maria. This instrument was very likely a catgut guitar, and perhaps a six-string guitar rather than the English guitar. Also, it should be noted, catgut does not refer to the guts of actual cats. It was short for cattle gut. I just don't want my fellow cat lovers to get offended. Anyway, back to the history of guitar in America. And it is also interesting to note that while Thomas Jefferson's instrument was primarily the fiddle, he was familiar enough with the six-string Spanish guitar to have made a sketch of the instrument's fingerboard with notes on how to play it. And this was probably produced around 1815 for his granddaughter, Virginia Randolph. So English and Spanish guitars coexisted for several decades, and a number of late 18th and early 19th century music teachers advertised instruction on both instruments. However, the English guitar quickly disappeared from view somewhere around 1825. However, the Spanish guitar continued to grow momentum. By 1830, let's say, a rage for the guitar that began in Europe in the 1810s had seized America. We've been playing ever since. However, one important detail to note is that most of these guitars built overseas, and some, on a smaller scale, may have been made by musicians themselves. Guitar construction on a large scale would not happen in this country until the mid-1830s. And for that, we have one man to thank, a German immigrant whose name to this day is still synonymous with guitars and craftsmanship, and whose company is well known for their guitar's sound. And I can attest to this as an owner of one myself. That man's name was C.F. Frederick Martin, or C.F. Martin. That's right, the Martin Guitar Company, or more specifically, C.F. Martin and Company, whose guitars have been played by the likes of Jimmie Rodgers, the country singer, not the pop singer, Hank Williams, Eric Clapton, Neil Young, and countless others. And I have to say, the story of the company is one that could almost be made into a movie. The story of the first American guitar company, which, as I said before, was C.F. Martin and Company, begins in 1796, when Christian Frederick Martin was born in 1796 in Partenkirchen, Germany. He came from a long line of professional woodworkers and was himself primarily a cabinet maker, as was his father. However, both his grandfather and great-grandfather were violin makers, and why his father did not follow in their footsteps is unknown. And C. Frederick's father also built guitars and saw that his son had an interest in building guitars as well. He approached the violin makers of legend in the German town, whose name I'm afraid of mispronouncing again, to see if young Christian could apprentice under them, but they declined because they said that the guitar was just a passing fad. And this was when C. Frederick Martin's father arranged a meeting with legendary Austrian guitar builder Johann Stouffer to have C. Frederick Martin apprenticed under him. And so C. Frederick Martin Sr. traveled to Vienna to get his formal apprenticeship under Stouffer when he was 15 years old, and he eventually became the foreman of Stouffer's shop. And while in Vienna, C. Frederick Martin met and fell in love with a harp teacher and singer named Ottilie Kuhl, and they eventually married, and the pair relocated to Germany soon after their first child, Christian Frederick Martin Jr., was born in 1825. The idea was C. Frederick Martin Sr. would set up shop building guitars there and they would live happily. But there was a constant battle with the Violin Makers Guild, who claimed they had the sole right to build any and all stringed instruments. And these battles went on for years, and the court sided with C. F. Martin Sr. every time because there was no mention of the guitar in any guild articles. Also, the guitars Christian was building were the best they'd ever seen. And everything was going well with C. F. Martin Sr., until his father passed away. He decided that he'd had enough of Germany and wanted a new opportunity. And so he set his sights on the land of opportunity. Martin Sr. gathered up his young family and boarded a U.S.-bound ship on September 9, 1833. They arrived in the New World on November the 6th of the same year. And C.F. Martin Sr. set up his first guitar shop in New York City in May of 1834, roughly, as that is the earliest label that is found in the sound hole of the oldest Martin guitar ever constructed. He continued making guitars in the Spanish construction using the fan bridge, and which he would later move on to from and use the pyramid bridge. And to anyone wondering what bridge means, it's the place that holds the pins that holds the strings. And during the 1840s, C.F. Martin began experimenting with brace shapes. Now, bracing is the structure behind the face of the guitar that adds support. Martin began using fan bracing, which is the style used in most Spanish guitars. However, during the 1840s, he began a new system of X-bracing. People were content with gut-string guitars for many years. However, as time went on, many musicians wanted to play with mandolin bands and similar instruments, which also meant the instruments needed to be larger and therefore louder. Well, they needed more volume. And in 1902, Martin created a triple O size, which meant more volume for the musicians. And Martin would later make a more important improvement in 1902. It was that year that Martin began offering steel string guitars rather than gut strings. Martin's first guitar to use steel strings was a custom order 0021. They later began offering steel string guitars on a larger scale during the 1910s. However, they were not the first company to mass market steel string guitars. That honor goes to another company whose history began in 1894. Of course, I'm referring to the Gibson Company. Gibson Company can trace its roots to Kalamazoo, Michigan, of all places, because that is where Gibson Guitar Company founder Orville Gibson first set up shop. Gibson began building acoustic guitars and mandolins in 1894. He pioneered a guitar design that featured a carved hollow top with an oval sound hole that would become the standard for the archtop guitar. And it didn't take long for demand of his handcrafted creations to take off, and so in 1902, he secured the financing to form the Gibson Mandolin Guitar Manufacturing Company. However, he would pass away in 1918 without being able to see how much of the success his namesake company would have later on. And in fact, the Gibson guitar has been called the most important guitar in the history of country music, and that is Maybelle Carter's Gibson L5, which she played in the Bristol sessions, which I talked about in my episode about the history of American music. Go back and listen to that one and then listen to this one if you haven't already listened to the episode about American music. Maybelle Carter was also Johnny Cash's mother-in-law, if for what it's worth. And Gibson would make history another time in 1922 when it became the first company to produce a factory-made guitar with steel strings and produced in quantity. And that was the Archtop Jazz L5 in 1922. The Martin Company would not switch to primarily steel strings until 1927. It was also during this time that another extremely important guitar in the history of country music would be bought by none other than the singing brakeman himself, Jimmie Rodgers. Again, go listen to the episode about the history of American music if you want to learn more about Jimmie Rodgers. In 1920, Rodgers bought a custom-made guitar from C.F. Martin and Company for $153, which is a little over $2,000 today. And he bought every single embellishment he could find and added it to the guitar. The guitar has a mother-of-pearl inlay, his name on the fretboard, and the word thanks written on the back, which he would flip around whenever the audience applauded. And that, in turn, brings us to another important milestone in the history of guitars, and that is the introduction of the first electric guitar. And for that, we have to go back to 1931. And that was when the first ever electric guitar was produced. It was a steel guitar, slide guitar really, which was nicknamed the Frying Pan, and it was invented by a man named George Beauchamp, who was a steel guitarist in a Hawaiian string band and got tired of having to play over the other instrumentalists. So he devised an electric amplification device, which is now called a pickup, which in turn was later bought out by the Rickenbacker Company, and the guitar was called the Frying Pan because of its shape. And in 1936, Gibson became the first company to use a pickup on a traditional guitar, which they marketed as the Gibson ES-150, which included a single coil bar pickup and was used to help popularize jazz music. Further developments would come in 1941 when a man named Les Paul, yes, that Les Paul, he was a real man, created the Log, which was a Gibson pickup mounted onto a 4x4 block of solid maple wood with the string to avoid the feedback problems that acoustic electric guitars had at the time. And for the sake of appearance, he attached the body of an Epiphone hollow body guitar, sawn lengthwise with the log in the middle. This solved two problems: feedback, as the acoustic guitar no longer resonated with the amplified sound, and sustain, as the energy of the strings was not dissipated in generating sound through the guitar body. The Gibson Company would later release an electric guitar bearing Les Paul's name in 1952. However, I do realize I did get a bit ahead of myself because I did not discuss solid body electric guitars. Those happened in 1948 when a man named Leo Fender had parted ways with his partner Doc Kaufman. He had set out to create a guitar that concentrated on utility and practicality and less on design aesthetics. He wanted to create a regular guitar that had the clear sound similar to the sound coming from electric Hawaiian guitars, but without the feedback problems. And his result was a two pickup model he called the Broadcaster. And from this point on, all Fender necks incorporated truss rods. The Gretsch Company, which itself was a manufacturer of hollow body electric guitars, claimed the Broadcaster violated the trademark for its Broadcaster with a K line of drums. As a newcomer to the industry, Fender decided to change its name to Telecaster, which is still used to this day. And I'm sorry to say this, folks, but it looks like our time has run out on us. But before we leave, I would like to thank the people at Guitar.com, TrueFire.com, GuitarWorld.com, and TheGuitarBlog.com for their information that I use to make this episode. With that, goodbye and God bless.